They looked at her like she was nothing, as if Thomas's entire life meant nothing. By morning, they laughed at Agnes Holloway. By evening, strangers were offering millions for that same rusted workshop. That was the one thing nobody in the family could explain. Agnes was 66, widowed, and standing alone on a cold March day in northern Georgia, while her relatives pointed at the broken windows, calling her husband's life work junk. Thomas Holloway had been gone for 3 years, but his tools were still there. His notebooks remained, and the locked back room which Agnes had not opened since the funeral still held the key to everything. And then Glenn Rusk stepped forward.
I once called Thomas a friend, now I'll offer to clear the entire workshop for free.
Every box, every paper, and every machine part gone before sunrise. Agnes almost agreed, but then she felt the old key in her pocket, remembering Thomas's final warning. Do not let them empty that workshop. Everything I couldn't say is still in there.
No. And hours later, a black SUV stopped at my front gate.
A stranger stepped out with a leather folder and an offer too massive for such a worthless place. If you believe people like Agnes deserve to be heard, subscribe now. Because what she uncovers in that workshop is not just worth money, it is worth remembering. But that life-changing offer did not arrive into a quiet morning. Before the black SUV, the leather folder, or any talk of millions, Agnes Holloway had already been made to feel like an outsider on her own land. The first thing they mocked was the porch, not Agnes herself. Not directly, at least not at first. They started with the porch because it was easier to insult old timber than a woman standing 10 feet away. The boards sagged, and the white paint peeled into thin curls. One corner of the railing slumped toward the yard, as if it had grown tired of holding itself up. Agnes stood near the steps in her faded brown coat, one hand tucked deep inside her pocket, her fingers wrapped tightly around that old workshop key. It was March 14th, 2024, in Habersham County, Georgia. The morning air still carried the cold bite of winter, but the dogwoods along the road showed small white blooms, and a soft breeze stirred the dead grass. Somewhere beyond the trees, a lone crow called out once, then fell silent.
I heard everything that morning, every boot scraping gravel, every hushed whisper, and every quiet laugh people thought I was too old to notice.
Her nephew Calvin stood beside his wife near the mailbox with his arms tightly folded across his chest.
I drove up from Gainesville in a polished truck, staring at the old house as if it personally offended me.
The roof desperately needed repairs, the gutters sagged, and the yard had grown wild around the fence posts. Behind the house, past a patch of red clay and weeds, Thomas's old workshop stood under a rust-colored metal roof. That was where Calvin kept staring not at Agnes, not at her face, but at the workshop, as if the building itself were the problem.
I stood just a few steps away in a pressed denim jacket and polished boots, wearing a calm smile. I had known Thomas for years. Or at least, that was what I liked to tell people. I looked toward the workshop and slowly shook my head. A place like that could fall in on itself. One bad storm, one loose sheet of metal, one accident, and Agnes would face more trouble than she could afford.
I nodded far too quickly.
His wife offered Agnes a soft look that was not true kindness, but rather pity dressed up for Sunday service. They told her she had done enough, that Thomas would never want her living like this, and that the property was simply too much for one woman.
Thomas left you a burden, Aunt Agnes, not a home.
Agnes looked past them toward the workshop as a strip of pale light caught on the dusty window for a second. She could almost see Thomas standing inside, sleeves rolled up, his reading glasses low on his nose, one hand holding a pencil, the other resting on some machine part. Only he understood people had called that place junk for years, but Thomas never did. To Thomas, every bent pipe had a potential purpose. Every old motor still had a second life, and every single notebook mattered.
Agnes, let me make this simple. I know people who can haul the workshop clean by morning. No cost to you, no stress, no need to sort through dusty boxes, and I said it gently, which only made it feel worse.
Because Glenn did not sound like someone offering genuine help, he sounded like a man trying desperately not to seem eager.
I could have explained myself. I could have said that some places hold more than market value, but I was too tired to beg people to respect what they had already mocked, so I said only one word, no, and Calvin looked away.
His wife closed her eyes for a moment, as if Agnes had embarrassed everyone. Glenn's smile stayed in place, but something dark shifted behind it. His eyes drifted toward the back of the workshop, toward the locked room with the warped wooden door. That was the room Agnes had not opened since Thomas died a few minutes later. they left her standing alone in the driveway. The gravel settled and the wind rustled through the grass again finally. Agnes turned and looked toward the quiet house. That ring. That was when she spotted the envelope tucked halfway under the front door, cream-colored, heavy paper, with no stamp and no return address. Her name was typed across the front, Mrs. Agnes Holloway, and inside, she found a formal purchase offer. It was not just for the land or the house the offer wanted everything. All outbuildings, stored equipment, records, drawings, and workshop contents.
I read those words twice. Then a third time, the old brass key suddenly felt cold in my hand.
The number printed at the bottom of the first page stopped her cold. It was not the kind of offer that arrived by accident. Someone had done research, knew what was inside that workshop, and had decided it was worth a great deal more than junk.
I set the envelope on the kitchen table and did not touch it again until after dark.
She made herself a cup of coffee, sat in Thomas's old chair by the window, and looked out at the workshop through the glass. The afternoon light faded slowly across the metal roof, turning it from rust to amber to a dull gray as the sun dropped behind the tree line.
Thomas always said that room held his most important work. Not the finished pieces, but the ideas still becoming something.
She had honored that for 3 years, leaving the locked door exactly as he left it. Now someone outside knew enough to want everything behind it, and Agnes needed to understand why before she signed a single line. She did not call Calvin that evening, nor did she reach out to Glenn.
I called my daughter instead, not to ask for advice, but simply to hear a voice that loved me without conditions attached.
The next morning, Agnes rose before sunrise and walked across the cold yard toward the workshop. The dew had settled thick on the grass, and her shoes left dark prints behind her as she crossed the open ground. The main workshop door swung open with a familiar groan of old hinges. The smell of oil, sawdust, and something faintly metallic met her at the threshold.
I had not stood inside this room in 3 years.
The benches were exactly as Thomas had left them, tools sorted by size along a wooden rack, coffee cans full of bolts and screws lined up on the shelf above. A pair of worn leather gloves rested on the corner of the workbench, as if Thomas had simply stepped outside for a moment and would be back shortly.
I stood there for a long time, not touching anything, just letting the room remind me of him.
Then she walked toward the back wall, past the tall metal shelves, past the stacked wooden crates, toward the door she had not opened since the day of his funeral. The key felt warmer in her hand now than it had the day before.
I put it into the lock slowly, as though Thomas might still be standing on the other side, not yet ready for the door to open.
The lock turned with a single, clean click. The back room was smaller than the main workshop, roughly the size of a large closet, with a low ceiling and one narrow window. A wooden drafting table stood along the far wall, covered in papers held flat by small metal weights. Beside it, a tall filing cabinet with hand-labeled drawers, each drawer marked in Thomas's careful block lettering. Stacked against the left wall were flat cardboard portfolio cases, the kind used for large architectural drawings.
I opened the first drawer.
Inside were folders sorted by year going back more than a decade, each one holding hand-drawn schematics, written notes in the margins, and small photographs of prototype parts. Thomas had been meticulous in a way Agnes had always admired but never fully understood until that morning. Every sketch was dated, initialed, and cross-referenced to a notebook number written in red ink on the upper corner.
He kept a system. He always kept a system, even when nobody was watching.
On the drafting table, pinned flat beneath a metal ruler, was a set of drawings unlike the others. These were cleaner, more refined, drawn on heavier paper with precise measurements noted in several columns along the right margin. At the top of the first page, Thomas had written a title in large letters. Agnes leaned in close and read it carefully. It was a water pump system specifically designed for emergency flood response in rural areas with limited infrastructure.
I had known Thomas worked on water systems. He mentioned it once or twice over the years, but I never understood how far along he had taken it.
The drawings showed a complete working design intake valve, pressure chamber, hand crank mechanism, and a filtration stage at the output end. In the lower right corner of each page, a small brass tag had been pressed into the paper, stamped with a serial number and a date. The date read, April 2017. Agnes carefully opened one of the flat portfolio cases against the wall. Inside were large format prints, the same design, but reproduced at full scale, with additional annotations in a different handwriting than Thomas's. She turned the print over and found a business name stamped on the back. It was a company she did not recognize, but the address printed beneath it was located 2 counties over.
I set everything back exactly as I found it, locked the door behind me, and went inside to make a phone call.
By noon that day, Agnes had spoken with a woman named Ruth Calloway, a retired paralegal who attended the same church and had helped neighbors with property questions for years. Ruth came by that afternoon, walked through the main workshop without comment, and then stood in the back room for nearly 20 minutes without speaking. When she finally turned around, her expression had changed. Ruth told Agnes quietly that what she was looking at was not junk, it was documentation, and documentation like this had legal weight.
I did not fully understand what she meant at first.
Ruth explained it carefully. If Thomas had designed something that was later developed or sold commercially without his name attached, the records in this room could matter a great deal. She asked Agnes not to speak to Glenn Rusk, not to respond to the purchase offer, and not to let anyone else into the workshop until Ruth had made a few calls.
I agreed without hesitation.
Over the following 4 days, Agnes waited. She kept the workshop locked, declined 2 phone calls from Glenn, and told Calvin's wife through the front screen door that she was not yet ready to discuss anything. On the 5th day, Ruth returned, this time with a man named Earl Briggs, who had spent 30 years as a mechanical engineer before retiring to the county. Earl walked into the back room, studied the drawings for a long time, picked up one folder, and then set it back down with both hands as if it were fragile. He told Agnes plainly that whoever designed this knew exactly what they were doing. The engineering was sound, the system was practical, and the date on those brass tags predated anything he had seen from the company named on the back of those prints by at least 3 years.
3 years.
Agnes repeated the words quietly, more to herself than to Earl or Ruth. Earl explained further, the company on the back of those prints had filed a patent for an emergency flood pump in late 2019. That patent had since been licensed to a larger firm and was now being used in a regional water management program worth a considerable amount of money. Thomas's original drawings, dated April 2017, showed the same fundamental design. Ruth looked at Agnes carefully and said the next step would require a proper attorney, not for a fight, but simply to establish the facts and protect what Agnes already owned.
I asked her if she thought Thomas had known what his work might become.
Ruth considered the question for a moment, then said she thought Thomas had known exactly what he had, which was why he locked that room and left Agnes the key.
I held on to that thought for a long time.
The attorney Ruth recommended was a woman named Sandra Cole, who practiced intellectual property and estate law in a town about 40 miles north. Sandra drove down 2 days later, spent 3 hours in the back room with the folders, and took careful photographs of every dated document. She did not make promises, but she was clear the record here was unusually strong, and Agnes had both the original materials and continuous documented possession of the property. Sandra advised Agnes to send a written response to the purchase offer, acknowledging receipt but stating that no decisions would be made until Agnes had completed her own review of the property's contents.
I signed that letter at the kitchen table and mailed it myself the following morning.
3 weeks passed. During that time, Agnes continued her routine. She tended her garden in the mornings, attended church on Sundays, and visited the workshop each afternoon to sit quietly at Thomas's workbench. She did not open the back room again during those weeks. Sandra had asked her to leave everything exactly as documented.
But simply being in the main workshop was enough. It felt like keeping him company.
Glenn Rusk drove past the property twice that Agnes noticed, once slowly in the late afternoon, once early on a Sunday morning. He did not stop either time, but Agnes saw the truck and understood that his interest had not faded.
He wanted something from that workshop, and now I was beginning to understand what it was.
On a Tuesday in late April, Sandra called with an update. The company named on the back of those portfolio prints had been contacted by Sandra's firm with a formal inquiry regarding the origin and dating of the design. Their legal team had responded not with denial, but with a request for a meeting. Sandra considered this a significant development. Companies that have nothing to answer for rarely request meetings in response to initial inquiries.
I asked Sandra what this meant for me, practically speaking.
Sandra explained that it likely meant someone within that company, or connected to it, already knew about Thomas's original work and had been watching the property. The purchase offer had almost certainly not been a coincidence.
I thought about Glenn Rusk standing in my driveway with his press jacket and polished boots, offering to haul everything away for free before sunrise.
Agnes said nothing more on the phone, but she sat with that thought for a long time after she hung up. The meeting was scheduled for the second week of May at Sandra's office, with representatives from the company and their legal team present. Agnes asked Ruth and Earl to come with her, not as legal support, but because they understood what was in that room in a way few others did. The morning of the meeting, Agnes dressed carefully, not formally, but neatly in a dark blouse and her good gray coat.
I put the old brass key in my coat pocket before I left the house, the same pocket where I'd held it that cold morning in March.
The drive north took just under an hour. Ruth sat in the front seat and did not fill the silence with small talk, which Agnes appreciated. Earl rode in the back and reviewed a small notepad he had prepared, occasionally reading something quietly to himself.
I watched the county roads pass through the window, the red clay banks, the pine rows, the small churches with hand-painted signs. I had lived in this country my whole life and never once thought of leaving it. Thomas was the same way.
Sandra's office was a converted Victorian house on a quiet street, neat, professional, and nothing like what Agnes had expected. Inside, a long table had been set up in the main conference room, with chairs on both sides and a carafe of water at the center. The company's representatives arrived 7 minutes late, 2 attorneys and a woman who introduced herself as a senior development representative. They were polite, measured, and careful with every word, the kind of careful that told Agnes they had prepared for this.
I had prepared to, just differently.
Sandra opened by presenting a timeline Thomas's original designs, their dates, the brass tags, the filing cabinet records, and the comparison to the patent filed in 2019. She laid out the documentation without drama, speaking plainly and pointing to specific items on printed copies arranged in front of each person at the table. The corporate attorney on the left made a note but said nothing. The one on the right asked a clarifying question about the chain of custody, meaning who had possessed the materials and when. Sandra answered precisely. Agnes Holloway had maintained continuous possession of the property and all its contents since Thomas Holloway's passing in 2021. The development representative studied one of the schematic copies for a long moment, then set it down face up on the table without turning it over.
I watched her look at it and recognized something in her expression. She had seen this design before.
Ruth noticed it too. Agnes could tell by the small, quiet breath Ruth took on her left side. Earl said nothing, but his hands rested flat on the table, very still. The corporate attorneys requested a brief recess. When they returned, the tone had shifted slightly, still guarded, but less performative. The left attorney acknowledged that the dating on the original materials was consistent with what Sandra had presented, and he suggested that a technical review by an independent assessor might be a productive next step for both parties. Sandra agreed, with the condition that Agnes retained custody of all original materials throughout the process.
I nodded once, and Sandra continued.
The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes in total. Nothing was resolved that day, but something had changed. The company was no longer pretending the documents did not exist.
On the drive back, I sat in the front seat and watched the land go by.
Ruth asked Agnes if she was all right.
I told her I was fine. I was just thinking about how far a key could take a person.
Earl laughed softly from the back seat. Over the next 6 weeks, the independent technical assessor reviewed Thomas's designs alongside the 2019 patent documentation. His report was thorough and took longer than expected. Earl said that was usually a sign the assessor was being careful, which was what you wanted. Agnes spent those weeks continuing her routine. The garden, the church, the afternoon visits to the workshop. She received one more call from Glenn Rusk during that period, short, careful, almost formal, asking if she had given any more thought to selling the property.
I told him no, thanked him, and ended the call.
He did not call again. The assessor's report arrived on a Thursday morning in late June. Sandra called Agnes before noon and read the key finding aloud over the phone. The assessor had determined that Thomas Holloway's original design, dated April 2017, represented a functionally and structurally equivalent precursor to the patented emergency pump system filed in 2019. The language was careful and technical, but the meaning was plain. Thomas had built it first.
I sat down in Thomas's chair when I heard those words. I did not plan to, but my legs simply carried me there.
Ruth came by that afternoon, and the three of them, Agnes, Ruth, and Earl, sat in the main workshop together. Nobody said very much for a while. Earl eventually said that Thomas was the kind of man who deserved to be known, and that was as much as any of them needed to hear out loud. Sandra began formal negotiations the following week. The process was not fast. It moved in the cautious, step-by-step manner of legal and corporate proceedings, with written exchanges and revised proposals arriving by post and by email. Agnes read every document Sandra sent her, asking questions when she did not understand something, and taking her time before agreeing to any next step.
Thomas always told me never to sign anything I had not read completely through at least twice.
By mid-July, the shape of a potential agreement had begun to emerge. The company was willing to acknowledge Thomas's prior design work, not publicly at first, but in formal written documentation as part of any settlement. Sandra pushed for a public record, proper attribution, and terms that would protect Agnes's ownership of the workshop contents permanently. Agnes trusted Sandra's judgment on the legal particulars, but she was clear about what mattered most to her.
I did not need a large settlement. I needed Thomas's name attached to what he built, and I needed the workshop left standing.
Sandra noted both requirements and returned to the table with them. A second formal meeting was scheduled for early August, this time at a neutral location, a conference room in a law office, halfway between Agnes's county and the company's registered address. Agnes asked Ruth and Earl to come again. Earl spent the 2 days before the meeting reviewing his notes and printing out a clean summary of the technical timeline, not for legal use, but so Agnes could hold something concrete in her hands if she needed it.
I appreciated that about Earl. He understood that having the facts in your hands felt different from simply knowing them in your head.
The second meeting was longer and harder than the first. The company's attorneys arrived with a counter-proposal that addressed some of Sandra's conditions, but fell short on the question of public attribution. Their position was that internal acknowledgement of Thomas's prior work was sufficient, that public attribution would create complications they were not willing to manage. Sandra held firm.
I listened carefully for most of that first hour, then I asked if I could say something directly.
Sandra nodded, and the room went quiet.
I told them that Thomas Holloway was not a complicated man. He never asked for recognition, never filed a patent, and never hired an attorney to protect what he built. I told them he built that pump because he believed people in flooded rural counties deserved clean water as much as anyone else did. I told them I was not there to take something from them. I was there to make sure Thomas's name was attached to something he actually built.
The room stayed quiet for a moment after Agnes finished speaking. One of the attorneys made a small note on his pad. The development representative looked at Agnes for a long moment, then looked down at the table. The second recess lasted nearly 30 minutes. When the corporate team returned, their lead attorney began by saying that the company recognized the significance of the original design contribution. He outlined a revised framework attribution in published technical records, a formal acknowledgement letter, and a structured settlement that included a provision Agnes had not expected. A portion of the settlement would fund a rural water access initiative in Thomas's name, operational in the same counties his design was intended to serve.
I asked them to repeat that part.
The attorney repeated it clearly, a funded initiative, Thomas Holloway's name attached, targeted to rural North Georgia communities.
I looked at Ruth, then at Earl.
Earl's jaw tightened slightly, not with anger, but with the particular expression of a man who has just heard something he knew should have happened a long time ago. The details still required review, revision, and several more rounds of correspondence, but the shape of the agreement was now something Agnes could recognize. On the drive home, she held the brass key in her coat pocket the whole way, just as she had done on the morning all of this began.
I thought about the day they stood in my driveway, pointing at the broken windows, telling me Thomas had left me a burden. And I thought about how close I had come to opening that door, handing Glenn Rusk the key, and watching everything disappear before sunrise.
She did not say any of this out loud. The road ran straight through the pines, and the afternoon light came through the windshield in long, pale strips.
Sometimes holding on is the only thing required. You don't need to know why, you just have to hold on until you do.
The formal agreement took another 3 weeks to finalize. Sandra reviewed every clause carefully and returned twice with amendments before advising Agnes that the final document was ready to sign. Agnes read it herself, all of it, over 2 evenings at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a notepad beside her. She made 3 small notes, sent them to Sandra, who addressed all three before the final signing.
Thomas would have done the same thing. He never signed anything without reading every word.
The signing took place on a quiet Friday morning at Sandra's office. Agnes arrived early, sat in the front room with a cup of coffee, and looked out the window at the street for a while before Sandra came to get her.
I was not nervous. I was simply very aware of how much had happened between that cold March morning and this one.
Ruth and Earl were both present. Sandra walked Agnes through each signature point, explaining every section clearly before Agnes put pen to paper. When it was done, Sandra set the pen down and said, simply, that Agnes had done well.
I told her Thomas had done the work. I just kept the door locked.
Ruth laughed quietly at that, and even Earl smiled. The corporate witnesses signed on their side of the table without ceremony. The room was quiet and ordinary, nothing like what Agnes had imagined a moment like this might feel like.
But then, most important things are quieter than you expect them to be.
Outside, the morning had warmed slightly, the kind of August morning that hints at autumn without yet committing to it.
I drove home alone, which felt right.
The workshop was waiting when she pulled into the driveway, the metal roof catching the late morning light the same way it always had.
I sat in the car for a moment before going inside. That old rusted roof had looked the same every single morning for years, but what it meant now was entirely different.
The final paperwork arrived by registered mail the following week. Agnes signed the receipt at the front door, carried the envelope to the kitchen table, and set it beside the original purchase offer she had kept in the drawer since March.
I looked at both of them for a moment, where this started and where it ended.
Then she put the original purchase offer in the recycling bin, filed the settlement documents in the cabinet Thomas had kept beside the refrigerator, and went out to tend her garden. The second formal meeting, the one that had shifted everything, stayed in Agnes's mind for a long time afterward. Not because of the legal outcome, but because of the silence in the room after she had spoken.
I had not prepared what I said. I just said what was true.
She had learned that from Thomas that plain truth, spoken without anger, is often the most powerful thing a person can say in a room full of people preparing to argue. Ruth called the week after the signing to check in and to pass along something Earl had said. Earl had told Ruth that in 30 years of engineering work, he had rarely seen documentation as complete and careful as what Thomas had kept in that back room. He said that level of care was not an accident, it was the mark of someone who understood the value of what they were building and intended it to matter.
I wrote that down and kept it.
The weeks that followed the settlement brought small, practical changes. A contractor came to assess the porch, the one Glenn and Calvin had mocked as evidence that Thomas had left Agnes a burden. The contractor told Agnes the porch was structurally repairable, and that the wood, though weathered, was old-growth pine that had held for decades, and would hold for decades more if properly maintained.
Old and still standing, Thomas would have appreciated that.
There was also the matter of Glen Rusk, which Agnes had not yet fully settled in her own mind. She knew from Ruth, who had done some quiet research, that Glenn had been the one to pass Thomas's name and design information to the company years earlier, likely in exchange for a finder's arrangement that had never been disclosed to the Holloways. He had not stolen the drawings outright, the originals were still in that filing cabinet, but he had shared what he had seen, and someone had used it.
I thought about what Thomas would have said about that.
Thomas was not a man given to bitterness. He would have been disappointed, but he would not have spent long on it.
I decided to follow his example, not because I wasn't angry, but because staying angry at Glenn would have meant giving him a room in my mind he hadn't earned.
The settlement terms did not require Glenn to be named publicly, and Sandra had advised Agnes that pursuing him separately would cost more than it returned. Agnes agreed not out of forgiveness, but out of clarity about what she was actually after.
What I wanted was never about Glenn Rusk, it was about Thomas Holloway.
The Rural Water Initiative began its organizational work that fall. Agnes was not involved in the operational details that was handled through the settlement administrator, but she received quarterly updates and had been asked to provide a brief written statement about Thomas for the initiative's founding documentation.
I wrote 2 drafts before I was satisfied. It took me longer than I expected to describe Thomas in a few paragraphs, because the truth about a person rarely fits neatly into something short.
She wrote about his patience, the way he would sit with a problem for weeks before reaching for a tool. She wrote about his notebooks, how every page was dated, every idea cross-referenced, every failure noted alongside what he learned from it. And she wrote about his reason that Thomas had started the pump project after a flood had cut off clean water to 3 small communities he knew personally, and that he had never stopped working on it because he never stopped thinking about those people.
That was Thomas. He never built anything, just to build it. He always built it for someone.
The statement was included in the initiative's founding documents without edits. Agnes received a copy in the mail, and she read it once at the kitchen table, then walked it out to the workshop and set it on Thomas's bench.
I don't know if that was the right thing to do, but it felt right, and sometimes that's the only measure available.
By October, the workshop had been visited by a local history group interested in rural Georgia invention and technology. Ruth had made the introduction, and Agnes had agreed to a small, guided session, not a formal exhibition, just an open afternoon where people could walk through and ask questions. 6 people came, which was exactly the right number. Earl was there to answer the technical questions, and Agnes walked them through the history what Thomas had built, when he had built it, and why.
I had told that story so many times in my head over the previous months that speaking it out loud felt almost easy.
One of the visitors, a retired schoolteacher from the next county over, asked Agnes if Thomas had known how important his work would turn out to be.
I thought about that for a moment before answering. I said Thomas knew it was important, he just never assumed anyone else would agree.
The teacher nodded as if that answer explained a great deal. It was the heavy stillness that occurs when people face the truth and wonder how much of it they can still deny. Across the table, the representative from Clear Spring stared down at her papers. One attorney shifted uneasily in his chair. The other lawyer closed his folder halfway, then opened it again, hoping to buy a little more time. Agnes just waited. Having spent 3 years in an empty house, Agnes knew how to sit in silence without fear. Ruth did not speak for her. Earl did not try to explain the machine again for once. Nobody stepped in to decide what Agnes was allowed to understand. The corporate team requested another recess this time. Agnes stood up before they could leave the room.
My voice stayed perfectly calm. I told them I was not there to ruin anyone, and I did not care about fame. And I would not pretend Thomas Holloway never existed just because a corporate check could make the paperwork disappear. I laid Thomas's original letter on the table, not a copy, but his true words, his reason, the man himself.
When the corporate team returned, the atmosphere had shifted. Their offer changed, though not all at once, and without apology. Corporate executives with high-priced attorneys rarely surrender easily, but the deal's structure shifted, and the land would remain in Agnes's hands. The workshop contents would stay untouched. Thomas Holloway's original dated designs would be officially acknowledged in writing. His vital contribution to the early emergency pump would be publicly recognized. A financial settlement would finally secure her home, protect the workshop, and allow her to live without fearing the next bill. The deal also included funding for a rural emergency water initiative established in Thomas's name. It was not flashy, but highly practical, exactly what Thomas would have wanted. And Glenn Rusk was absent from the room, yet his name lingered in the notes and dates, written in the scratched initials on the brass tag, and detailed in the phone records Ruth later obtained. And in his rush to empty the workshop before Agnes found the truth, he did not go to prison, and this was not that kind of ending. Yet in a tight-knit county, reputation can become its own locked door. Neighbors stopped calling him for advice, refused to trust him with land deals, and no longer believed his smooth talk. For a proud man like Glenn, that daily rejection was a heavy punishment. A month later, the first repairs began at Agnes's place. Workers braced the porch, replaced the gutters, and patched the roof before the summer storms arrived, but the workshop remained standing.
I refused to let it go. I had the door repaired, the windows cleaned, and the floor made safe.
The old coffee cans remained on the shelves, still bearing Thomas's handwritten labels. The old lamp still hung above the workbench even after Earl repaired the electrical wiring. Thomas's pump remained exactly where he left it, no longer hidden beneath a dusty canvas shroud. Right beside it, Ruth helped Agnes display a small framed note. Original flood model, Thomas Holloway, 2017, and underneath, in smaller print, the words read, "Built for families waiting on clean water."
Seeing Thomas's name printed like that for the first time, I did not weep aloud. I simply touched the frame and closed my eyes.
Some grief never truly leaves. It only changes shape. And for Agnes, that grief became work. Twice a month, she opened the workshop doors to local students, church groups, and folks wanting to hear the story behind the invention. Earl demonstrated how the hand crank worked. Ruth explained why preserving those records mattered.
I shared how Thomas believed everyday folks deserved real help when disasters struck, and through it all, I never spoke with bitterness.
Her lack of anger surprised people, but Agnes had not fought all that way just to become hard. She had fought to ensure Thomas's quiet gentleness was never mistaken for weakness then. Late one August afternoon, Calvin paid a visit.
I stood near the newly repaired porch, looking much smaller than Agnes remembered me. I offered an apology not perfectly phrased, but sincere enough for her to hear my deep shame. She did not pretend my words erased the past.
Forgiveness did not mean forgetting, but she allowed him to stay, look around the workshop, and realize the true legacy his uncle had left behind. Perhaps that was a profound lesson in itself. By autumn, emergency water kits bearing Thomas's name arrived at 3 rural fire stations in North Georgia. The milestone never made the national news. No crowds gathered in her yard, and no brass bands marched down her gravel driveway. Yet one rainy morning, she received a photograph from a grateful volunteer station. A small pump rested on a wooden folding table below it. A child slowly filled a cup. Thomas's name was etched on the side. Agnes stared at the photo in her kitchen, then quietly stepped outside. The dogwood trees had lost their blossoms. The cool autumn air smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Behind the house stood the workshop, its door repaired and clean windows catching the afternoon sun for years. Neighbors passed by and saw nothing but rust.
I once stared at that building with deep grief. Now my steady gaze showed a promise kept and a truth protected.
A lifetime of hard work was finally clear to see neighbors mocked her refusal to sell, calling her stubborn. They dismissed the old workshop as junk, but Agnes Holloway held a truth they completely failed to see. Often, the world discards what it lacks the patience to understand, and sometimes, the most underestimated person is the only one left standing to save it. If this story reminded you of an elder whose voice deserves more respect, please like this video and subscribe for more. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have taken that money and stayed silent?